APA Decoded, Part 2, Citing Sources. So discussed in this section, we're going to take a look at how to use the author date method, how to use a direct quote, and when to use a block quote. So the APA method, or APA citation style, uses what's called the author date citation system to cite references. And basically this has two parts. There's an in-text citation used inside the paper, and then that has a corresponding reference that is then listed in the reference list at the very end of the paper. So for part 2 here, we're going to focus on that in-text citation, which always has the author and the date married together. And then in part 4, we're going to take a look at that reference that's listed in the reference list. So when we say the author date method, again, we really mean that when you list the in-text citation, in text meaning in the body of your text of your paper, that the author and the date are always together. The name of the author is directly followed by the date. There's never anything between them. They're always immediately together. So it's either going to appear as author, and then the date in parentheses, like in a sentence it might say something like Harris, parentheses, 1989, parentheses, notes that children are really smart, period. Or you might say something like children are really smart, parentheses, Harris, comma, 1989, parentheses, period. Or you might write something like a recent study, parentheses, Harris, comma, 2003, parentheses, indicates that. So you'll notice in all of these examples, whether you're using Harris as a subject of a sentence, like in our first example, Harris, 1989, notes, where we're using Harris as a subject of a sentence and it's not actually inside the parentheses, or we have something else being used as a subject of a sentence, like a recent study, and then Harris is inside the parentheses because it's not actually the name being used as the subject of a sentence. In all cases, the author is right next to the date somehow. Either the date is always inside the parentheses, and the author's name is either outside of the parentheses but right next to the date, or inside the parentheses right next to the date. And the date is always the year. You don't have the month, and you don't have the day. It's just the year. That's it. And that's pretty much the author date method. You always cite the studies. You never say ambiguous things like, well, research indicates that the climate is changing, or studies show that college students are getting smarter over time. You never say bogus things like that without citing that. If you're going to say something, you must cite it. Because anyone can make up any bogus statement. You must cite if you're going to say something big like that, or any kind of factual statement like that, research or studies or bold statements like that must be backed up by the author date method. You can't just throw that out there. And if you do that in a paper, I'm going to jump on that and say, where's your citation? So be looking for that. Okay, so that's the author date method. Now, the next question is, well, what if there's a direct quote? So going back to the first example, anytime you're paraphrasing, anytime you're sharing an idea that somebody had or somebody indicated, or you're paraphrasing a study, you should always be throwing these author dates in there to cite that study, okay? What if there's a direct quote, though, and you want to actually quote somebody? Here's how you do the direct quote. If you have a direct quote, the extra element that you're throwing in there is, of course, the quotation. But whenever you have a quotation, you're also going to show the page number or page numbers that quotation is on. So you include the page number when it's a direct quote. So here's how that would look. Harris, 1989, notes, comma, children can also imagine believing something that they know to be false. Page 77. And the page number goes outside of the quotation because Harris did not actually say page 77 in his quote. Page 77 is not something he said. So that goes outside of the quotation mark. But you'll notice the period goes after the parentheses after the page number. So note my little red arrow there showing you where the period goes. It doesn't go inside the quotation, it goes outside. You can also write this a different way. You could also do it like this. Quote, children can also imagine believing something that they know to be false, and then put your entire in-text citation at the end of that and say, parenthesis, Harris, comma, 1989, comma, page 77, period. So you do your in-text citations with the author, there's the date, and then there's the page number. You never do page numbers if it's not a direct quote. Sometimes I see overzealous students that love to put page numbers in all of their in-text citations, and that is not necessary. You only do a page number if it's a direct quote. Okay, so don't be over the top. What if your direct quote is a question? Well, don't sweat it. You still end with the page number. So there's an example there of Dixon. How does the case of Singapore fit into the interdependence hypothesis? Question mark. You still have your end of your quote and then your page number, period. What if your quote ends in an exclamation mark? Quote, be specific, exclamation mark, end quote. Same thing. You still have your page number there and you end with a period. So I know you'll probably try to throw another loophole at me and be like, but what if this, but what if that? There's always a way to handle it. But what if there's no page numbers? If there's no page numbers, I know I didn't throw this on the slide. If there's no page numbers, then you list the paragraph number. It appears on P-A-R-A dot 3, paragraph 3 of the website. So there's always a solution. That's why it helps to have that APA manual for those crazy situations, because it's in there. The APA manual addresses all of that. All right. What if the quote is from an electronic source? Oh, I did make a slide for this. Oh, I'm so proud of myself. There's no page numbers. You use the abbreviation PARA, P-A-R-A, period. So here's my example, Rabanovich, any, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, comma, 2008, comma, paragraph 5. What if there's no page or paragraph numbers? Well, then you cite the heading and the number of the paragraphs that follow the heading to direct the reader to the location of the quoted material. So, Darling Hammond, 1994, the conclusion section, paragraph 2. So you do the best you can. All right. Now is the age-old question. When or when not to use a block quote? And also a caveat before we get into block quotes. Whenever we're talking about quotes and we're talking about writing, use quotations, short or long, short or block quotes, sparingly. You should only be using a quotation in your writing if it says something that you yourself cannot paraphrase or put into your own words. If it expresses something that really is so much better said in the original author's words. Too often I see novice writers that rely heavily on quotations of other people's work, and they never develop their own writing voice. So in your writing, try to write without hardly any quotations so that you force yourself to develop your own writing voice. So that's my caveat to you, because I see way too many graduate students, since I'm making this for graduate students, write using too many quotations. So use quotes sparingly, only if they really add something in a unique way to your paper. Okay, that being said, short quotes, so quotes that just go directly into the text, are for words that are 40 words, pretty much less than 40 words. If you have a quote that's 40 words or more, it becomes a block quote. So a block quote is something that looks like this. It looks like a block of text that sticks out, or rather is indented and kind of stands out a little bit more. So you'll see this one looks kind of like this. Harris describes how to test whether memory affects children's ability to recognize ambivalent feelings. On the other hand, if children really do find... So you see it goes right into the block quote. So, what are some things we note about this? Well, we could change the introduction here. First of all, we could shorten the lead-in there. You'll notice the lead-in directs right into the block quote with a colon, and it could be shortened. It could be shortened to something like this. Harris writes that. On the other hand, if children really do find it difficult to recognize. And that would work too. If you counted word for word in the block quote, which I'm not going to do, you would notice that it's probably over 40 words. You can use the word count feature on your word processor to find out if something needs to be a block quote or not. What are some other things that you should note here? There's no quotation marks around a block quote. There never is. There's also no punctuation marks after the parenthesis. So you'll notice that the period comes before the page number that ends the parenthesis. And because I mentioned Harris 1989 at the beginning of the block quote, I don't have to put it with page 112. If I didn't mention that Harris writes that at the beginning of the sentence, then I would have to say Harris 1989, page 112. So it all depends on where you mention who is saying what. This is indented. All block quotes are indented 5 spaces in, and all lines are indented. So the entire block is indented inward. So that's kind of how that looks.